That should be going. Okay. Ecology. Ecology is study of, it comes under biology. It's a study of ecosystems, different environments that organisms live in, and their requirements and things like that. And this is an ecosphere. You can buy them online. They're not very expensive. I've actually thought about getting one of these for my kids because it's like the simplest pet you could possibly have. There's tiny little, if you look closely, there's little orange brine shrimp in there. So they, from your perspective, they're like little, I suppose, little prawns or something like that. Now, that is a sealed system, okay? So they've sealed that, it's permanently sealed, you can't unscrew it. And so no water goes in, no water goes out, no gases go in or out, okay? They've got a little bit of soil with a few nutrients in there, they've got a little planty thing, which can photosynthesize. Now this is a great model for the Earth. Sunlight does get in, but nothing else does. And the oldest one of these that is still functioning is 5 or 6 decades now. It's been going. So think about that in terms of brine shrimp, which only live maybe a month. The number of generations of brine shrimp that have survived in this particular system. What they're doing is they're feeding on plant material, okay? They're pooping, of course. The plant's getting nutrients from that, and it's also photosynthesizing its own sugar, okay? Now, without that plant, nothing survives, right? And that plant is capable of making its own food through photosynthesis, and that's why this system is running. And it just keeps cycling and cycling and cycling and cycling. So it's quite effective. Yes?
Have you heard of Biosphere 2?
Yes. Know quite a bit about Biosphere 2. It was interesting. And Biosphere 2 was an experiment where they basically, it was a large, almost greenhouse-like building with different little mini biomes in there. And they were seeing how long people could survive in this environment. And they actually were growing their own food and things like that. But they weren't getting many calories, about 1,500 calories a day. But they, and it was very interesting from a scientific perspective because the way their bodies were functioning, it changed. It was quite different to what you would typically expect to see because of the calorie restriction. Yes? Okay. So anyway, back to our little ecosystem thing. This is a nice little model of effectively what the Earth is. The Earth's considerably larger, but it's a closed system. We do get, strangely enough, comets bring water from space, more than you would imagine, about an inch every 10,000 years, and that's globally. So, that's a lot of water. But we lose stuff into space as well, like helium is in very limited supplies because of that. So, now I might put that in present mode. Okay. Now, there's some additional reading there, and that's available to you on the webpage as well. These are the key points that we need to look at. What is an ecosystem? There's biotic and abiotic we've seen before, probably year 7 and year 8. Biotic being alive and abiotic being... Biotic is alive or has been alive. So a stick is biotic, even though it's dead. Abiotic... Yes. Abiotic is never having been alive. Habitat, ecological niche. Niche doesn't really get tested. Niche doesn't really get tested. Population versus community. Population is for one species. Community is all the species in an environment. And you'll see with their ecosystems, they can be quite large, like the Amazon. And we'll look at some really, really small ones. One of the more famous ones is the Lord Howe stick insect one on, I think it's called Ball's Pyramid, off New Zealand, which was effectively a single bush about this high on a rock shelf about this long that was the only repository for those insects globally. Yes?
I made an ecosystem in a jar.
We just did that, dude.
Henry!
Oh,
So, thanks for did it work?
yes.
It balanced?
Still alive.
It's still alive. How long's it been in the jar?
3 months.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. So Henry, if you didn't hear, said he's made an ecosystem in a jar. So he's made his own little ecosphere, and it's balanced out. And you can see how that could be problematic if there's too many of one thing or too few nutrients or something like that.
Starting, well, the millipedes died.
Oh, so it's an actual, not an aquatic one.
Well, I used to have an aquatic one, but I left it in the sun too long.
Okay. Now, these terms here, you've seen before in year 7, and you'll need to refamiliarise yourself with producers, consumers, decomposers, and food chains and food webs. They're considered in terms of assessment nice and gentle, because we'll give you a food web, which is many food chains, and we'll ask you something along the lines of, oh, what happens if we introduce, I don't know, feral cats into this Australian food web? And any reasonable kind of answer to that question is accepted. So you could say, well, it's going to eat all of the birds, or it might be eating the possums, which means that the birds have more food available to them because they're not competing with possums for nectar. Yes?
Well, we still get my bosses.
Yes. Okay, so those are the key things that we're looking at. Right, this is the things you're going to have to highlight. That part there, what an ecosystem is. Ecosystems, students typically think of an ecosystem as, oh, check, it's a thing with animals in it. And that's true. It's a living community with multiple species, plants and animals, fine, that's fantastic. But it's also the physical surroundings and the interactions between both. And I'll show you a slide in a little bit, which just looks at water. In fact, it's on the next page at the top right. And just water, you'll see there's a whole bunch of things. And we're just talking about water, let alone air, let alone weather, all these sorts of things that are obviously not living, but do affect living things, like the salinity of the water, the temperature of the water. Henry learned that one. The amount of water, the frequency of storms, whether or not the water gets contaminated, all of these things impact the living things in the environment. So you've got to think of both the living community, many species, the physical surroundings, which aren't alive, and the interactions in between. The picture of the bird on the next slide, which is on your page, shows that pretty well. The bird is alive, it interacts with other living things, but also there's plenty of non-living things. Biotic factors, alive or have been alive, competitors, parasites, predators, parasites, vegetation. Competitors can be the same species, different species. Yeah? Primary producers we'll have a look at. Decomposers, detritivores. Decomposers and detritivores are different things. We've got that on another slide. Decomposers are fantastic for environments because they break down nutrient-rich waste, and a lot of the nutrients they release get back into the soil, back into the environment. A decomposer is a different ballgame. Decomposers, like you and me, tend to consume and get a lot of the nutrients and keep it for themselves. Okay, and so there's a key difference. Abiotic factors, you don't need to write those down. You do need to be aware of them. You should be able to name a few in any given environment. Look at a picture of something, look out the window, and you should be able to go, oh, there's abiotic things out there, non-living things. The trees, no. But the air itself, the water, in this case rain, the temperature outside, humidity, type of soil, daylight hours, dissolved oxygen, pH, topography, all of these are non-living things, but they all determine, especially things like oxygen content in water, especially you'll see that this summer has been a problem. They're all key in determining whether things can survive or not, or whether some species may be more successful than other species. Question, is an ecosphere an ecosystem? Are these things, is that little ecosphere an ecosystem?
Yes.
Yes.
Hopefully you're thinking yes. So what are some biotic and abiotic components? Yep.
Brine shrimp?
Sorry, what?
Brine shrimp and
Brine shrimp, I'll give you one. Brine shrimp, what else? Yep.
The water.
The water itself is abiotic, yes. Anything else?
A plant.
Yeah, the plant itself, which is key. Any ecosystem has to have a primary producer. Well, the glass is technically encompassing it, but internally, it's got an internal surface, so we'll give you that one. Yes?
the dirt at the bottom.
Actually, yes, this dirt on the bottom is very important as well, because it contains nutrients which are non-living. The dirt itself is non-living, so it's abiotic. There's probably quite a few bacteria in there as well, because the brine shrimp themselves will have bacteria, and there'll probably be bacteria even associated, or possibly fungi associated with the plant. So there's going to be a few things going on there. And then don't forget water temperature, gas concentrations, both oxygen and carbon dioxide, salinity of the water, the pH of the water, all of these different things. Ecosystems, when they start off, can be a bit, these can be a bit bumbly. They might put in 20 brine shrimp at the start, and 18 of them die because the environment, either they're not suited for the environment or what have you, but the two that survive then have offspring that subsequently are suited for that environment, or can survive in that environment, but not too many offspring, because you can often get sort of these boom and bust cycles, and then it will stabilise, and you'll have just a few brine shrimp at any given time. So not a bad little model of an ecosystem. There's the bird picture I told you about. If you want to colour code it yourself, you can do so. You should be able to, in a situation like this, pick up what's biotic, what's abiotic. You can see all of the red ones are biotic, and yes, you have to count humans as well. We're key, because we impact environments in a lot of different ways. Competitors, as I mentioned, can be the same species or different species. Parasites, they estimate that for every organism on the planet, there are 3 parasites that prey upon it. And if you start thinking about that too much, you go crazy, because you go, do parasites get parasites? And yes, they do. So, in terms of a biological strategy, some people have argued that parasites are the most successful organisms on the planet. Some of them, the whole goal with a parasite is don't kill the host. Keep them going. Yes?
That means that with a parasite, the parasite will have 3 parasites, and those 3 parasites will each have 3 parasites.
Up to a point.
What the hell?
Up to a point. But,
When does
sorry,
it
what?
stop?
I'm sort of saying,
Are they all different?
different. Like
Does it stop?
they estimate, there's 30 million species, or there's 100 million species. But these are, like, if you try and factor in things like bacteria, anything single-celled, you go down on that oval and you take a soil sample, you're going to get 5,000 species. Take one step of about a metre and take another soil sample, and you're going to get different species. They'll be a lot the same, but they'll be different, there'll be diversity. So, in terms of variation, there's enormous numbers. So parasites themselves, and remember, a parasite, it doesn't benefit the host. Okay? Some of them are pretty mild. The host won't suffer too much from having them present, but it doesn't benefit the host. But some parasites can be quite nasty indeed, and if the parasite load gets too great, it can kill the host. Your gut flora aren't parasites, they're symbiotes. We need them to survive, and they want you to be healthy and happy as well, because you're just a big meat robot, and you eat and bring them food. So they do their job, you do your job, and everyone gets along. This you don't need to write down, but this is an example again. Look, 3, 6, 18 different abiotic factors just related to water. So there is some double up. Wave action, clarity of water, how clear it is, because that can determine whether predators are successful or things like that. So all sorts of things come into play in terms of ecosystems. And the variance between ecosystems and niches is what affects whether or not, or what type of species flourish in those environments. Now, habitat, we'll need that one, where organisms live. Terrestrial meaning land, aquatic meaning water, fair enough. Ecological niche, we don't really talk about, but typically you get one organism in a particular niche, okay? And that's all of the abiotic and biotic factors combined together to make a niche, that little area that an organism survives, okay? Population is one species, a community is many species. You need to be aware of that. There's an example, 2,600 metres down, there's an event like a fumarole in the ocean floor, and you have very hot water, can be 110 degrees because of pressure, so it's above boiling but it's still liquid. And a lot of minerals will come out of that. Now, there's no photosynthesis at 2,600 metres. Yes, Ruben?
It's chemosynthesis.
It's chemosynthesis. Well done. Chemosynthesis is when you use chemicals, bacteria use chemicals to drive a process that ultimately produces glucose. Okay? So photosynthesis is always a producer at the start of a food chain or a food web. You can't have an ecosystem without those producers making food. And at that depth, it's bacteria. And then the tube worms, those weird looking things that are not spaghetti, they metabolize the bacteria, and then other things eat the tube worms, such as ventfish or crabs. Or sometimes a fish might eat small crabs. And so that is a very short food chain, a very constrained ecosystem in its own right, because that might be, I said to the other class, a few metres across in some cases, and then it's just pitch black, icy cold and nothing. It's completely barren until you reach the next event. Okay, so it's this little island of life on the bottom of the ocean where you have these organisms surviving. It's pretty grim in terms of an environment, not very exciting. So obviously submarines can use to take that photo. Any questions about any of that? Yeah, the other small, that's a very small ecosystem there. This is a little bit more on niches, but as I said, you don't get tested on niches. But if you were walking around, I don't know, in a park or perhaps a wetland, you might look and you go, oh, there's a bunch of different bird species here, and they all occupy the same niche. It's wetland, and you'd be wrong in that respect. You can see from this picture that these birds have different lengths of beaks. They're probably preying upon different insects, or they have different food types. So even though they're sharing broadly the same ecosystem, they're not fighting necessarily for the exact same food resources. There might be some overlap, but there's going to be some difference as well. Okay, so this bird here is quite specialised in the types of organisms it's going for in the soil or in the water versus the other birds. Okay, because typically what happens, if you get two animals and their niche is exactly the same in terms of the food they need and the conditions they need and the nesting sites and everything like that, one of those species will go extinct in that area. Okay? An example of this in Australia is dingoes arriving with the Aboriginal people, and the Tasmanian tiger was the marsupial equivalent of a wolf. It was pretty good at its job. It got the job done in terms of hunting marsupials, other marsupials, but dingoes are faster. And, they're faster. They're a bit better at being a predator than the Tasmanian tigers, and slowly but surely, because they occupy the same niche, more dingo puppies are being born each year than Tasmanian tiger puppies because they're getting more of the food. And the Tasmanian tiger became extinct on the mainland, and then subsequently we killed it in Tasmania, which is just kind of sad. Okay. Now, Mr. Lord Howe stick insect. If you go to Melbourne, you can see Lord Howe stick insects, but you can't touch them. These guys were extinct because of a shipwreck. Subsequently, rats escaped from the ship, and on the particular island, I think it was New Zealand, and they just ate all of the Lord Howe stick insects. So that was it. That was the end of them. And so they were classed as extinct. And then, 2001, 20 kilometres away, Ball's Pyramid, scientists found a single bush on a little rock shelf. Now, that's not an island. That's an extinct volcano, which has collapsed. The whole volcano has collapsed except for this blade of rock sticking out of the ocean. And there's just this tiny little rock ledge with a little bit of soil and a single bush, and they found some droppings, and they found 24 Lord Howe stick insects. And so they visited there, Sydney and 2 to Melbourne. The 2 in Sydney died, and the 2 in Melbourne became sick. And the expert in Melbourne who was responsible for caring for them came up with a solution. If you click that link, there's a whole article about it. Came up with a particular mineral solution that he fed to them, and they survived. And now there's hundreds of them at Melbourne, and their goal is ultimately to restock them on Lord Howe Island. And yeah, you look at them, I find them interesting because as insects go, they don't look very insecty, they're very ancient. So all of the insects and beetles that we're used to looking at, you go, oh yeah, you know, that's a beetle, that would, yeah. But these guys, you can sort of see, oh yeah, they were around when dinosaurs were around, and so they're quite primitive looking, but successful in their own right. But obviously, with rats arriving as a new predator and introduced species, they didn't stand a chance of that thing. And yeah, how far is it? 20 kilometres away. So how do you reckon the insects got on Ball's Pyramid? Yep.
Reductions in the environment.
But how do they get there? That's what I'm saying. It's 20 kilometres distance.
Before the volcano and stuff collapsed, there was a landing between the two places, maybe?
Possibly, yeah.
I was going to say they swam.
Swam. Look, what may have happened, yeah?
The volcano grew.
No. Okay. Oh, you mean like plate tectonics? Yeah. No, the plate moves, but everything on the plate stays the same.
What if it was a hot spot?
The hot spot here makes the volcano. The plate moves over it.
Yeah.
Here's Lord Howe Island. Here's the new volcano.
Yeah, so it moved.
Oh, you're saying Lord Howe Island's here and the volcano popped up. Yeah, no, it probably hasn't happened. It's going to be something weird like, you know, a few insects get trapped on a piece of debris that gets washed out to sea and it just rolls up on that shore. Possibly a storm has blown some across there. That's happened before. I don't know if eggs could be carried by a bird, but somehow, some way it happened. Yes.
Maybe they were already native to the area of volcanoes. We just didn't know.
The volcano's pretty small and is quite devoid of life, except pretty much that little bush. You're not going to be examined on this. This is just, again, another small ecosystem. I always like to creep students out by pointing out that you've got about 4 kilograms of bacteria in your gut, very useful, in fact necessary for life. You've got it's about 1,500 species now they've identified in human mouths. So at some stage in the future, you're going to see this lovely boy or girl and you might canoodle and then you will exchange mouth flora. Okay, your 1,500 species and their 1,500 species will combine, and it's very romantic. So in terms of bacterial content, the classic scenario of a computer keyboard has more bacteria on it than a toilet seat. True, toilet seats, not a lot of nutrition. Keyboards, you're always eating Pringles and stuff. There's heaps of food. But of course, again, a toilet seat has fewer bacteria than your mouth does. But they're good bacteria. They're not sharing you. They've found their niche. You eat stuff and they get a bit of sugar and things, and that's fantastic. But if you eat some contaminated food, and there's maybe another bacteria on there that would love to infect your mouth or your gut, there's already 1 million of each different species in your mouth. They're not sharing you. You are a valuable resource. So it's very hard for foreign bacteria to successfully push themselves into this fully occupied ecosystem. What percentage of genes in your body are you? 23,000 genes, and bacteria have 1 million different genes. So what percentage of the genes in your body are you? You can do the math, it's not that hard.
2.3.
Is it 2.3?
0.023.
0.23. Yeah. 0.23% of the genes in your body are you. More realistically, they say that in terms of cells, in terms of cell number, you have, I think, 37 trillion human cells, and you have about 10 times more bacterial cells. So, we're saying 90% of, in total cell count, 90% of the cells associated with you are bacteria, and 10% are 10% are you and 90% are bacteria. You know, so you're mainly bacteria, but they're just very small, very handy. Keep you alive. Okay, we won't worry about that.
Yeah, Dr. Massey, it's definitely 2.3.
It's 1,000
It's- No. No, 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 no.
0.23.
No, it can't be 2.3.
No, because one is
If it's, yes, it was dividing by 1,000, guys.
23,000 in a million.
23 related to 1,000.
We're-
Oh, it is 2.3.
Yeah,
Yeah, you're right, I'm wrong. 2.3%. There you go, Jess. I hope you feel better. It's 2.3%. I love the math. Okay. Connor and Bodie, though, convinced it was 2.3. They were right.
It's still pretty good.
Okay, now you've already got that note there. These are the notes you need to take, like colour those, because you're going to get questions to determine whether or not you can distinguish between what is an autotroph, what is a heterotroph.
Is it from the one producer or is it from the top of the page?
You've already got that. You already know what an ecosystem is. An ecosystem is a community of living things, many species. It is the physical surroundings, the interactions in between. But this is the key part. You did this in year 7, and guys, you need to pay attention. You did this in year 7, but you'll need to be refamiliarise yourself with this. So producers are normally photoautotrophs, meaning they put down there photosynthesize. Synthesize. Okay, so you'll need to have that. They photosynthesize. Okay. So take sunlight, inorganic materials. They make organic compounds. They make food. Again, you two will need to take notes. Okay, I'll check at the end. And if you haven't, you won't be going to listen. So the key part here with producers is they make food. You don't get a food web or a food chain of any kind unless you have a producer. Okay? We eat food that already exists. Plant material, things like that, we can get our nutrients from that, we can get glucose from that. But we can't make food, okay? We can't take inorganic things like carbon dioxide and water and convert them to glucose, okay? We don't do that, but the producers do. Now consumers, these are heterotrophs. That's a new word for you. Autotroph and heterotroph, so highlight those. Obtain energy and nutrients by ingesting organic matter of living or dead organisms. Okay? So that's what consumers do, and there's different classes of consumers. And lastly, we have decomposers. They're really important. Now, highlight that keyword, excrete. They push out enzymes into the environment. That breaks down organic matter, and then they only ingest, that is, take in some of those nutrients. So this is very, very helpful for the environment. The rest of the things return to the environment. So in a simple diagram, producer leads to consumer. Now ultimately, they will both die and go to a decomposer, and that decomposer will ultimately, it's not really, the decomposer's not being eaten, but the nutrients, the decomposer's nutrients will feed back to the producers to keep things going. And that's what's happening in that ecosphere. Okay, you've got the plant as a producer, you have brine shrimp as a consumer, both bits of the plant are dying, bits of the brine shrimp are dying, but as long as there's definitely some decomposers in that environment, they're releasing nutrients. Yes?
When a mushroom dies, does it get decomposed?
Yes, it does. So there is a loop as well. Yeah. And the mushroom will be decomposed by decomposers. So if you really want to, you can do that. Circle of life. There you go. So that's a key difference. You're going to have to be careful to not get a decomposer confused with a detritivore, which is a new word for you guys, but is detritivores take detritus, which is waste, and they usually use it for themselves, but some of it does also get back to the environment. Okay, I hopefully can change there. You don't need to write this down. Obviously put a coloured box around the carbon dioxide equation because carbon dioxide equation, around the photosynthesis box equation, because you will need to be conversant with that. So that is what a producer is doing. It's taking inorganic materials and photosynthesizing. If it's a photosynthetic, a chemosynthetic one is different. It's like the one of the bacteria on the bottom of the ocean. And it's producing glucose. Now, you've got three very different ecosystems in that picture, but in every one of those ecosystems, two of them, you clearly have green photosynthesizing producers. The third one looks barren of green producers, but they're there. Okay, might be single-celled algae or krill or something like that, but they are definitely there, and subsequently smaller organisms feed upon them, then small fish, then large fish, then penguins feed upon the fish, and off it goes. Seals are feeding on the fish. So, in all environments, you have to have a producer, okay? And you're going to have an energy source, but that's not drawn in the food web, okay? The food webs and food chains always start with producers. Don't draw the sun in a food chain or a food web. Nothing is eating the sun. The sunlight is here in this equation. So it's occurring within the producer, but we don't draw it within the food chain or food web. Terror birds. Fascinating article on terror birds. We're looking at a bird in this case that would have been 3.5 metres tall.
Like Kevin in art.
Sorry, what?
There's a bird called Kevin in
Yes.
a river.
Yes.
And it's
Except
a big, colourful bird.
unlike Kevin, these were apex predators. They
So
were
was
meat eaters.
Kevin.
Kevin wasn't a
What's
meat
an
eater.
apex
He was a
predator?
chocolate eater. Don't think
I
I
don't
would say.
know.
No, don't ruin my childhood.
That's not
Now-
very different to a terror.
Consumers can be subdivided into groups. Now, this is where we'll get tripped up. First order consumers are always herbivores. They always eat plant material, or they're eating a producer of some kind. Okay? They're called primary consumers. So you've got first order consumer, primary consumer, and herbivore are three terms for the same organism. Okay? A second order consumer is always a carnivore. Okay? Or a secondary consumer. It's on level 2. Okay? And then you have third and fourth order consumers, and they're carnivores that eat carnivores, or carnivores that eat carnivores that eat carnivores that eat herbivores. Okay? So it's hard as you get further up the line to, for example, a osprey is a bird of prey that eats fairly large fish, which might eat fairly small fish, which might eat plant material of some kind. And so you're getting into third order consumerism, fourth order consumerism. But there's a limit to how large food chains and food webs can get because of the 10% rule that you looked at in year 7. So be conscious, second order consumers are always carnivores, third order consumers and fourth order consumers, also called, those are new terms, tertiary and quaternary consumers. Okay, now what's our timeline? 10:41. Okay. So tertiary means 3, quaternary means 4. I don't think you'll ever get a question with that, but you can. But third and fourth order consumers, and so the types of questions that you'll probably do today, and you'll certainly get an assessment of some kind, are things like, in this food chain or food web, identify a producer, identify a consumer, identify a third order consumer. Okay, and you'll have to go, does that mean that it's 2 levels above herbivore or 3 levels above herbivore? Okay, and finally, omnivores, that's you, plants and animals. Detritivores, that's the one I told you about that is new, you have to be conscious of. They break down organic matter. and decaying matter, but they tend to utilise it for themselves. Some of the nutrients get into the environment, but they use most of those things for themselves. So they're quite different from a decomposer. Now, I've got a little video on ecosystems. Oh, that's a good one. I'll just tell you this is a horror story, but we'll watch the little video. But that's Desmodex. So, Desmodex is one of my favourite organisms. There's some fascinating YouTube videos online. This is not to scale. This large thing here is an eyelash.
What? Are you sure?
And then you can see they've stuffed themselves in to the eyelash follicle. So yes, they are a human. They're not really. They're a commensal organism. They're not a parasite, but they're a decomposer. They eat the oil and dead skin on your face. They can move. I've forgotten what speed is it. 8 to 16 millimeters an hour. So they run like the wind. So when you go to sleep at night and you're snoozing away last night, in fact, you know, they come marching out of your eyelash follicles. Yes, you have about 1,000 that can live on your face. That's your ecosphere. Your face, unless you're an oily teenager, you could probably hold 2,000. And they come out now. Interesting. There's wait. I'll tell you one more thing. I'll class as parasitic mites. I suppose they are. They don't really hurt us, but they do break down skin material and everything. Interestingly enough, Desmodex, it's quite a long mite, so they're a relative of spiders. They're a cousin of spiders. They have 8 legs, but they don't have. And it gets better. They don't have an anus, so they can't poop. So this bag back here just fills up with mite poop. Gets bigger and bigger. And finally, after a long and fruitful life of maybe fathering many hundreds of children and great-grandchildren, this particular mite will die. It'll crawl into your eyelash follicle, it will die, and then it bursts. And sprays mite poop everywhere. Now, some people get really bad skin rashes, red skin rashes, and they used to give them steroids, and the thinking was, oh, you know, it's a genetic condition, or it's this or that or that. And so they're starting to think now that some people might be allergic to the fecal matter of face mites. And there are YouTube videos where people's eyelashes and the eyes get very inflamed because everyone here has probably got a balanced ecosystem of face mites. Well done, everyone. But in some cases, you get a population explosion, and so people get this really bad inflammation. So you'll see videos of they get their eyelashes scraped, and they'll be collecting mites off them to try and. So it's like what they would do with So it's pretty delicate work, and you can see them. That's the crazy thing. You can see them. This is coloured. They're less than a millimetre, but not by much, and they're translucent, so they're more see-through. This is coloured, so that it makes it a bit more exciting. But apparently, so if you look really closely in the mirror tonight, there's your homework. Have a good hard look.
Yeah, it's about the size of about a quarter, not even about 8.
Yeah. And see if you can detect these fascinating parasites that make your face home.
Spiders living inside of our face.
Let's have a look at this.
Or when they die.
I didn't need to know that.
It's really great that they still
I thought it was about all half without knowing